Hi AI class, it's Professor Opterbeck, and we're going to talk in this video about some portions of the EU AI Act as well as the GDPR that relate to transparency and explainability of AI. So the parts we're going to look at include these listed here. So we see in Article 13 there are some provisions relating to high-risk AI systems. Remember that the EU Act is divided into this notion of having some AI systems that are high risk and some AI systems that are general purpose AI systems. And so for high risk systems, there are some specific requirements, particularly about instructions for use. And we'll see how those instructions for use relate to, in some cases, these issues of transparency and explainability. And then when we get into Article 14, we talked about this a little bit in our previous video last week, that there are requirements for human oversight of high-risk AI systems, and those human oversight requirements relate to this question, or at least some of them relate to this question of explainability. We'll see one specific provision in Article 26 relating to use of systems in the high-risk systems in the workplace and a duty to notify workers, and we'll come back and talk about some U.S. law in another video and compare that to some U.S. law that's developing in some of the states for AI. Then we'll take a look at Article 50, which relates to a variety of different kinds of AI systems, and depending on their functions has notice requirements, which is a kind of transparency requirement for consumers that they are interacting with that kind of system. We'll take a peek at Article 78. Article 78 talks about the EU's duty, the regulator's duty, to keep business information and trade secret information confidential. And we'll talk a little bit about the potential tension between confidentiality of that kind of information and these transparency requirements. And then finally, we'll take a look at the GDPR Article 22, which predates the AI Act, but already has obligations in it about automated decision making. So let's now turn to Article 13 of the AI Act. So looking now at Article 13 of the EU AI Act, we can see that there's a general requirement that high-risk AI systems be designed and developed in a way that will ensure transparency and that will put obligations both on the provider, the creator of the system, and the deployer who's putting it into the stream of commerce. And in Part 2 and Part 3, or Subpart 2 and Subpart 3 of Article 13, we can see that the main way the Act is trying to do that is through requiring instructions for use. Part 2 of Article 13 notes that those instructions need to be in a digital format or otherwise concise, accessible. So the idea is that these are accessible to the deployer and to the user. And then there's a relatively lengthy but also somewhat general description of the kinds of things that need to go in those instructions. So talking about the capabilities, limitations of performance, the way that the system is going to work, what its purpose is, how we're going to measure whether the system is performing, in particular with security in the way that it's supposed to be performing, the kinds of circumstances in which it might lead to risks, right? Are there reasonably foreseeable circumstances, given how it's going to be used, that it might cause some kind of risks? What are the capabilities and characteristics of the kind of information that would be provided in order to explain its output, right? So see here that transparency and explainability are going together in many ways, right? So explainability, we want the user to understand and the deployer to understand what the system is actually doing and what kind of decisions it has made. And transparency, we want the user to know what the system is doing, how it's working. And so how it's working includes what kind of information is it giving to explain what decisions it has made, and how can you access that information. Now, the transparency requirement, the instructions for use, also include information about any specific person or group the system is supposed to be used on. Is it relating to a particular group of people or kind of person in a certain way? And information about the training data, and information about how to interpret the output and how to use it appropriately. And now notice all of these things have these kind of general sort of limitations, right, where appropriate. So none of these are setting out absolute requirements or any kind of detail at this point. And the whole Act, of course, envisions that the regulatory authorities that will be set up will be supplying more of that detail, including perhaps standard forms of instruction for certain kinds of systems or things like that. So where appropriate, not exactly detailed yet, but information about how the system works, who it's meant to be used on, how it's trained, what kind of decisions it's making, and how to interpret the decisions that it's making. Now, if it is the kind of system that's designed to change over time, as many AI systems are, then the provider is going to have an obligation to, when it gets approval for that system with the regulators, to indicate how the system might change. And then it's going to have to provide that information about how the system might change to users in these obligations. And as we noted last week, for high-risk systems, there are these human oversight requirements, and the transparency obligation is going to include giving a notice to the user about what kind of human oversight is actually being employed in the system. Computational and hardware resources. And so if you're going to be using and running this system, if you're a deployer who's putting the system out there, if you're a user who's using it, what do you need to keep using it and to keep maintaining it? And how is information being logged and being stored and being kept? So part of explainability is having information that is available, that shows what the system was doing, that shows what the information the system might have collected from a user, so that the user can know that. So are there changes that are kind of possibility of changes that are baked into the system? What is the specifics of the human oversight? What kind of resources are needed to keep it going? And what kind of information is being logged and made accessible to the user? All of these are transparency requirements that have to be built into what the Act describes as instructions for use. Now, you recall from our previous video that with high-risk AI systems, one of the basic requirements is going to be human oversight. Then as we look into subpart 4 of that human oversight requirement, we'll see that this relates to transparency and explainability. So this human being who needs to be in the loop has to be able to understand what the capacities and limits of the system are, to be aware of tendencies where the system kind of might go off track, and then to be able to interpret the system's output, and then to decide, having interpreted the output, whether to not use the system or whether to intervene in the use of the system if something is going wrong, right? But this human being in the loop has to be the one who is able to know what the system is doing and know what decisions it's making and why it's making certain decisions. Now, Article 26 of the Act is putting certain obligations on deployers of high-risk AI systems. Remember, developers are the ones who are creating the systems, deployers are the ones who are putting the systems into use. And one of those specific obligations on deployers is if the deployer is an employer, right? If it's an employer using a high-risk system, then the workers' representatives and anyone who's going to be any affected worker who's going to use the system has to be notified that they're going to be subject to the use of such a system. So a specific obligation here placed on employers. Now we can again kind of correlate this a bit to GDPR. GDPR and privacy is a general privacy regulation, and it, among other entities, puts obligations on employers concerning workplace privacy. So there's a real concern within the EU about the rights of employers, and there's also a particular concern because of the history of labor in the EU of the rights of labor, and we see this showing up here with this specific obligation on employers. And we'll see that within the US there are some states who are putting similar obligations like that on employers or prospective employers who might be using AI systems. Now, looking at Article 50, when we've moved into Article 50, notice that we've moved into a new chapter, a new section of the EU AI Act. So we're not dealing only with high-risk systems anymore. This is not the section on general purpose AI. It's not the section on banned AI systems, but it simply is putting obligations on different kinds of systems. So when we look at Article 50, we see that it's dealing specifically with transparency obligations for certain kinds of systems performing certain functions or interacting with people in certain ways. And the kinds of transparency obligations we'll see fall into a few different buckets. So one would be a notification to the user that they are interacting with an AI system and not, for example, with a real human being, or a notification that an AI system is being used and deployed, or some kind of marking on the output of the AI system. And if we take a look at these, we can see, any AI system that's interacting directly with a person has to be designed and developed in a way that people are informed, that they know they are interacting with an AI system, unless it is obvious to essentially a reasonable person that they're interacting with an AI system. So, if you're deploying a customer service chatbot, I would say you have an obligation to notify if that chatbot is an AI chatbot and not a human chatbot, for example. So providers that are supplying an AI system that generates synthetic audio, image, video, or text content, a large language model that is a language generator like ChatGPT, for example, or an image generator like DALL-E, right? All of these kinds of things would fall under this category. The outputs need to be marked in a machine-readable format so that the content can be detectable as artificially generated or manipulated. This is, I think, a really significant obligation. It's something that would really immediately and pretty dynamically, I think, change the way large language models are currently being used in the marketplace. And it would require development of some kind of technological watermarking standard to indicate that content was generated in this fashion. So I think this is a pretty immediately impactful obligation. Emotion recognition or biometric categorization systems, if these are being deployed, the deployer must inform people that they're being exposed to those systems. A image, audio, or video system that could constitute a deepfake needs to make disclosure that the content has been artificially generated or manipulated, and that is going to be a higher level of disclosure than sort of the ordinary electronic tagging for any other kind of generated content. So, and then there's some other portions of Article 50 that's just indicating, needs to be a clear and readable manner. It has to be available at the time of the first interaction, and the AI office is going to work on developing codes and standard models and language and presumably technological standards through which this could be implemented. So again, this applies beyond high risk, and it's a pretty broad obligation to give notice and or to put markings that AI content is being used or that the output of a system is AI generated. Article 78 addresses confidentiality, and what we're talking about here is not the privacy or confidentiality of user data, but we're talking about the confidentiality of business information, trade secrets, intellectual property, and the like that a provider or a deployer might have to disclose to the regulatory authorities. There's always a tension between transparency obligations and explainability, we could say here as well, and the need for businesses to keep trade secret and other confidential information secret and confidential. And we see this in lots of regulatory areas. For example, in the US with the Food and Drug Administration, the drug manufacturer has to produce information and file information showing the safety and efficacy of the drug, clinical trials and things like that. That might include trade secret information, and so there has to be ways to kind of segregate and keep some of that information still secret and confidential while providing enough information for the public to be able to evaluate what the regulator is doing and what the disclosures are. So something similar here, and it just talks generally about the obligation of the regulatory authorities to keep that information confidential. And this is a real point of tension with these kinds of AI regulation and AI developers, and even now, as you see pushback kind of continuing to this regulation. This is one of the places where developers are saying, well, it's not clear how much of this we can actually do, and it's not clear how much we can really disclose how we're doing it, because some of that information might be trade secret, and that will just be an ongoing tension. Finally, for this video, we're going to take a look at the GDPR Article 22. And as mentioned, the GDPR predates the AI Act, but notice that the GDPR already has an obligation that a data subject, so that's an individual whose personally identifiable information is being collected and processed, has a right to not be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, which means there is a right to choose not to do that. It means that there's a requirement to disclose to the data subject if something like that is happening. So there's already a transparency obligation with respect to certain kinds of processing built into the GDPR, and that is then integrated also and connected with the other obligations under the new AI Act.